July 7, 1968, just after 1:45 a.m. Harlem was quiet in a way it rarely was, the kind of silence that came only after the last restaurant lights dimmed and the streets surrendered to the early morning. A black Cadillac moved steadily through the darkness, its engine low, controlled, unremarkable. Inside that car sat two men whose names were already woven into the fabric of Harlem crime history, though neither of them knew that one era had just ended and another had begun. In the back seat, Bumpy Johnson pressed a hand to his chest, breathing shallowly, while behind the wheel Frank Lucas kept his eyes forward, unaware that the road ahead would permanently redefine power in New York organized crime. For more than 3 decades, Harlem had existed under a fragile balance of authority shaped by deals, rivalries, and restraint. Bumpy Johnson was not simply a criminal figure. He was a mediator between worlds, a man who negotiated survival between Black Harlem and the Italian Mafia, maintaining order through influence rather than chaos. His reputation had been built slowly, reinforced by prison time, loyalty, and a refusal to disappear. Frank Lucas, by contrast, had lived in the margins of power, observing rather than commanding, learning rather than leading. Their relationship was not accidental. In Harlem crime history, mentorship often determined who lived long enough to matter, and Frank had spent years absorbing lessons without demanding recognition. That quiet positioning would soon prove decisive in what would later be understood as part of the American gangster real story. The defining act. The car slowed near 146th Street when Bumpy's breathing changed. It was subtle at first, then unmistakable. His voice, once commanding, carried strain when he told Frank to pull over. The moment was not dramatic, but it was final. Frank reacted without hesitation, guided by instinct rather than strategy, bringing the Cadillac to the curb as Bumpy struggled to stand before collapsing onto the sidewalk. There were no witnesses who understood the significance of what they were seeing, only a driver and his mentor confronting the limits of control. In that instant, no deals mattered, no reputations applied. Power meant nothing against the body's refusal to continue. Rising pressure and conflict. Frank knew what waited beyond that curb. The Italian Mafia had tolerated Bumpy, not respected him. Rival Harlem crews watched constantly for weakness. Corrupt law enforcement balanced enforcement with profit. Federal investigations had lingered for years, patient and unresolved. The moment Bumpy Johnson died, Harlem would become contested territory. Frank understood that survival in New York organized crime depended not on speed or aggression, but on timing and perception. Every delay, every decision would be interpreted by enemies already preparing to move. This was not panic, it was inevitability closing in. Psychology and power. As Bumpy lay dying in the back seat, his words were not emotional but deliberate. He did not speak of regret or fear, but of trust and responsibility. Silence, he implied, would no longer be enough. Reputation alone would not protect Harlem. Loyalty, once a shield, would soon become a test. Frank listened without interruption, aware that this was not advice but instruction. The transfer of power in the Harlem drug empire would not be formal or public. It would be psychological, shaped by who acted first and who hesitated. Frank did not argue, not because he agreed, but because he understood that refusal would leave a vacuum others would exploit. Consequences and fallout. When the Cadillac reached Bumpy's home, the transformation was already underway. The man who had maintained peace through negotiation was gone, leaving behind territory without an owner and rules without enforcement. Frank moved carefully, honoring Bumpy's final request, knowing that how he behaved in these first hours would define his future. There would be no announcements, no immediate confrontations, yet word would spread regardless, carried by silence rather than noise. In true crime documentary history, this is often how power changes hands, not through spectacle but through restraint. By the time dawn approached Harlem, nothing appeared different on the surface. The streets remained familiar, the routines unchanged. But beneath that calm, a shift had already occurred. The death of Bumpy Johnson marked more than the end of a man. It signaled the collapse of an agreement that had kept violence contained for years. Frank Lucas now stood at the edge of a decision that would reshape the balance between Mafia versus Frank Lucas, alter federal priorities, and redefine how power operated in Harlem crime history. The night had ended, but its consequences were only beginning. The vacuum. The morning after July 7, 1968, Harlem woke without realizing it no longer had a center of gravity. News of Bumpy Johnson's death did not break with sirens or headlines. It moved the way real power shifts always do, quietly, through phone calls that ended too quickly, through doors that closed a little more firmly than usual, through men who suddenly stopped waiting for permission. In apartments, storefront offices, and back rooms across Harlem, people recalculated their positions. For years, Bumpy's presence had been an unspoken guarantee that disputes would not spiral into open war. With that guarantee gone, uncertainty became the most dangerous force in the neighborhood. Harlem crime history has shown that chaos rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as opportunity. Frank Lucas did not leave the house that morning. He understood that visibility was risk and silence was leverage. As the man who had been closest to Bumpy in his final years, he was already being discussed by people who had never spoken his name aloud before. Some saw him as a placeholder, others as a liability, and a few as an obstacle. None yet saw him as inevitable. That distinction mattered. In New York organized crime, the first mistake is declaring yourself too early, because the second mistake is believing no one is watching. Frank remained still, not out of fear, but because stillness allowed him to listen. By midday, the Italian Mafia knew Bumpy Johnson was dead. Their reaction was controlled, professional, and cold. Bumpy had been useful, not beloved, and his death removed a complication rather than creating a tragedy. The arrangement that had allowed Harlem a degree of autonomy was never permanent, only tolerated. Within hours, conversations began about reclaiming percentages, reasserting influence, and identifying who would be expected to fall in line. The assumption was simple and deeply ingrained in the logic of the era. Without Bumpy, Harlem would fracture and fractured territory could be managed. This assumption would soon be tested, but at that moment it shaped every move being made beyond the neighborhood. Rival Harlem crews reacted differently. Some believed the vacuum meant freedom, others believed it meant vulnerability. The younger operators, men who had grown restless under Bumpy's long reign, saw a brief opening to expand. Older figures remembered what happened the last time Harlem lacked a stabilizing force and advised caution. No one trusted anyone, and trust had always been the currency that mattered most. Frank Lucas observed all of this without intervening. He understood that the Harlem drug empire did not belong to the loudest voice, but to the one who could survive the longest without forcing confrontation. Law enforcement also noticed the silence. Corrupt officers who had relied on predictability began to worry that unpredictability would expose arrangements best left unexamined. Federal investigators, patient by design, recognized that moments of transition often produced mistakes. In the American Gangster real story, this phase is rarely visible to the public, yet it is when outcomes are decided. Pressure does not come from a single direction. It accumulates until someone moves too soon or too late. Frank's restraint was not accidental. It was a response to pressure he understood better than most. Inside Bumpy Johnson's home, the weight of absence was physical. His personal effects remained untouched, his routines abruptly irrelevant. Frank moved through the space with respect, not nostalgia. He knew that sentimentality could not guide what came next. Bumpy had ruled through balance, maintaining order by negotiating between enemies who preferred stability to chaos. Frank recognized that he could not replicate that approach exactly, because the conditions that allowed it no longer existed. The question was not whether the structure would change, but who would control that change. Word spread that the funeral would be large. That detail mattered. Funerals in Harlem were never just acts of mourning, they were public measurements of influence. Who attended, who stayed away, who sent representatives instead of appearing personally, all of it communicated intent. Frank allowed the planning to proceed without interference, knowing the gathering itself would reveal where loyalties truly rested. He understood that appearances could not be rushed, only observed. In true crime documentary analysis, this is often the point where ambition collides with patience, and patience usually wins. Privately, Frank evaluated his position with precision. He was not the most feared man in Harlem, nor the richest, nor the most violent. What he possessed was something less visible and more durable: knowledge. Years spent driving Bumpy had taught him not only routes and schedules, but human behavior. He had watched deals succeed and fail, seen loyalty rewarded and punished, and learned how reputation was built through consistency rather than force. In the developing conflict between Mafia versus Frank Lucas, that understanding would become his primary defense. As evening approached, the neighborhood remained deceptively calm. No shots were fired, no territory was openly challenged. Yet everyone sensed that the balance was temporary. Frank knew that hesitation from others was not respect, it was assessment. They were waiting to see whether he would step forward, step back, or step aside. In Harlem crime history, indecision is often mistaken for weakness, but Frank understood that timing defined strength. He would not announce himself. He would let the moment demand his presence. By nightfall, the reality was unavoidable. Bumpy Johnson was gone, and nothing could replace the structure he had maintained. The vacuum was not empty. It was crowded with intentions, fears, and expectations. Frank Lucas stood at the center of that convergence without declaring ownership of it. The city, the mafia, rival crews, and law enforcement were all watching the same silence, each interpreting it differently. What none of them yet realized was that silence itself was becoming the signal. The era of negotiated restraint was ending, and a new phase of Harlem's power struggle was preparing to reveal itself, not through noise, but through an action that would soon make hesitation impossible. The decision that could not be undone. On the third day after Bumpy Johnson's death, Harlem no longer felt suspended between past and future. The quiet had shifted into something heavier, a collective awareness that restraint was temporary. Frank Lucas sensed it not through words but through changes in behavior. Conversations ended when he entered rooms. Men who once greeted him casually now studied him carefully, measuring tone, posture, and intent. The absence of open hostility did not signal safety, it signaled evaluation. In the unwritten language of Harlem crime history, this was the moment when potential leaders were tested, without being told they were on trial. Frank spent that day moving deliberately, not to assert control but to observe reactions. He walked familiar streets without an entourage, visited places he had known for years, and listened more than he spoke. Every glance told him something. Some faces carried expectation, others doubt, and a few revealed resentment that had long been suppressed under Bumpy's authority. Frank understood that leadership in New York organized crime was never granted. It was tolerated only after it proved unavoidable. The defining act would not be an announcement. It would be something that forced everyone else to respond. The pressure from outside Harlem intensified quietly. Italian representatives did not arrive in person, but messages began to circulate, polite in tone yet unmistakable in implication. Arrangements, they suggested, needed to be revisited. Stability required oversight. Percentages that had once been accepted as temporary could now be formalized. Frank recognized the familiarity of this language. It was the same logic that had shaped decades of organized crime relationships. Control framed as cooperation. He also recognized that accepting such terms would define him permanently, not as a successor, but as an intermediary without autonomy. The American gangster real story would not remember intermediaries. Within Harlem itself, rival figures tested boundaries indirectly. Small disputes were allowed to linger rather than being resolved quickly. Deliveries arrived late. Payments were questioned. None of these incidents were large enough to provoke retaliation, but together they formed a pattern. Frank understood the message being sent. Without Bumpy, enforcement was uncertain. He could ignore these signals and appear weak, or respond too aggressively and trigger escalation. The decision he faced was not whether to act, but how to act in a way that reshaped perception without igniting chaos. The answer came not from strategy, but from memory. Frank remembered watching Bumpy navigate similar moments years earlier, long before Frank was trusted with more than driving duties. Bumpy had always understood that symbolism mattered more than explanation. People did not follow speeches, they followed demonstrations of resolve. Frank realized that whatever he did next needed to be seen, interpreted, and remembered. It needed to communicate seriousness without inviting immediate violence. That balance was rare, but not impossible. The planning of Bumpy Johnson's funeral became the focal point. Funerals in Harlem were never private affairs. They were public records of influence. Frank understood that the gathering would bring together every faction with an interest in the neighborhood's future. Italian observers, Harlem operators, political figures, and community leaders would all be present, each watching the others as closely as the service itself. The funeral would not decide the future, but it would frame it. Frank made his decision there, not impulsively, but with full awareness of the consequences. In the days leading up to the service, Frank did something that confused those watching him. He did not consolidate territory, threaten rivals, or seek public endorsements. Instead, he focused on logistics, ensuring the funeral would proceed with precision and dignity. To some, this looked like deference. To others, it suggested calculation. Frank allowed the ambiguity to remain unresolved. In the psychology of power, uncertainty often commands more attention than confidence. Behind closed doors, however, Frank prepared for a moment that would redefine his position. He knew that once the act was completed, there would be no retreat, no plausible deniability. The Italian Mafia would interpret it as defiance. Rival Harlem crews would see it as a challenge. Law enforcement would mark it as a signal worth monitoring. Frank accepted that this single act would accelerate every conflict that had been building quietly since Bumpy's death. He also accepted that delaying further would only allow others to shape the narrative. The morning of the funeral arrived under overcast skies, a detail that did not go unnoticed. Harlem gathered not only to mourn but to assess what came next. Frank entered the church without ceremony, dressed simply, carrying himself with restraint. To those watching closely, his calm was unsettling. He did not look like a man overwhelmed by responsibility, nor like one eager to claim it. He looked prepared. In true crime documentary terms, this is often the moment when a figure transitions from participant to catalyst. When Frank made his move, it was neither rushed nor theatrical. It unfolded with deliberate clarity, leaving no room for misunderstanding. He did not raise his voice or issue threats. He did not reference future plans or past grievances. Instead, he performed an act that spoke directly to loyalty, sacrifice, and legitimacy. Those present understood immediately that the meaning extended far beyond the ceremony itself. This was not about honoring the dead alone. It was about defining the living. The reaction was immediate and irreversible. Conversations stopped. Calculations were revised. Some saw courage, others saw provocation, but no one saw weakness. Frank had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, transforming perception in a way words never could. The vacuum left by Bumpy Johnson was no longer theoretical. It had been occupied, not through declaration, but through demonstration. As the service concluded and people dispersed back into the city, Harlem felt different. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Frank Lucas was no longer being evaluated as a possibility. He was now a problem to be addressed, a force to be accounted for. The defining act had done what it was meant to do. It removed ambiguity. From this point forward, every response would be shaped by the understanding that Frank had chosen confrontation with inevitability, rather than accommodation with decline. The decision had been made, publicly and without retreat. Harlem's future would now be contested under new terms, and the cost of that choice would soon become apparent. The next phase would not be about symbolism or patience, but about survival under pressure from every direction at once. The quiet days were over, and the consequences of Frank's action were already beginning to close in. Pressure from every direction. The days following the funeral did not bring immediate violence, but they brought something more dangerous: attention. Harlem absorbed Frank Lucas's defining act with a mix of admiration, suspicion, and unease. What had been a quiet evaluation turned into active scrutiny. Men who had once watched from a distance now began to test responses, not through direct confrontation, but through calculated disruptions. In Harlem crime history, this phase is where many aspirants fail, not because they lack ambition, but because they misunderstand how pressure accumulates. Frank understood that the real threat was not a single enemy, but the convergence of many forces acting independently toward the same conclusion. The Italian Mafia moved first, though not publicly. Meetings were held outside Harlem, conversations framed as discussions about continuity rather than control. Their logic was consistent with decades of New York organized crime. No territory was allowed to operate without oversight. Bumpy Johnson had been tolerated because he provided stability, predictability, and profit. Frank Lucas represented uncertainty. He was younger, less visible, and untested at scale. From the Mafia's perspective, uncertainty was risk, and risk required correction. The expectation was that Frank would eventually seek accommodation, because most men did when confronted with institutional power. Within Harlem, rival groups escalated their probes. Minor disputes were allowed to grow instead of being settled quickly. Rumors circulated questioning Frank's legitimacy, not loudly, but persistently. Some claimed he lacked the temperament to enforce order. Others suggested he would be forced into dependency on outside interests. Frank responded to none of it directly. He knew that responding too quickly would validate the doubts, while ignoring them entirely would invite further erosion. His approach was selective enforcement, addressing issues quietly and decisively without drawing attention to himself. It was a delicate balance, one that required discipline rather than aggression. Corrupt law enforcement added another layer of pressure. Officers who had benefited from predictability under Bumpy now faced uncertainty that threatened their arrangements. Some attempted to reassert influence through intimidation, others through subtle warnings. Federal investigators, meanwhile, watched patiently. They understood that transitions in the Harlem drug empire often produced mistakes, not because people became reckless, but because coordination broke down. Frank was aware of this dynamic and adjusted accordingly, reducing exposure and limiting the number of people involved in sensitive decisions. He did not assume protection where none had been earned. Psychologically, the strain was constant. Frank operated under the understanding that every decision would be interpreted as precedent. Silence could be read as weakness, decisiveness as provocation. Loyalty was tested daily, sometimes subtly, sometimes openly. Frank placed greater emphasis on behavior than on declarations, watching who followed instructions without complaint and who hesitated. In the American Gangster real story, loyalty is rarely declared. It is revealed under pressure. Frank built his inner circle slowly, prioritizing reliability over enthusiasm. The Italian Mafia's patience began to thin as weeks passed without Frank seeking dialogue. Messages became more direct, less polite. The implication was clear. Autonomy would not be granted indefinitely. Frank understood that this was not personal. It was structural. Organized crime had rules shaped by history, and those rules did not accommodate independence easily. The question was not whether confrontation would occur, but when and under what conditions. Frank's objective was to ensure that when it came, it would be on terms that favored preparation rather than surprise. At the same time, Harlem itself began to respond to the new reality. Community figures who had relied on Bumpy's mediation grew anxious about stability. Some approached Frank cautiously, not to pledge allegiance, but to seek reassurance. Frank offered none explicitly. Instead, he emphasized continuity, order, and restraint, framing his approach as protection rather than ambition. This distinction mattered. In true crime documentary analysis, leaders who present themselves as protectors rather than conquerors often gain legitimacy that outlasts intimidation. Privately, Frank evaluated the sustainability of the existing structure. He recognized that Bumpy's system had been built for a different era, one in which negotiation with external powers was unavoidable. Frank believed that dependency was the greatest vulnerability. His thinking did not revolve around expansion for its own sake, but around insulation from external leverage. This mindset would soon drive decisions that escalated the conflict beyond Harlem, drawing attention from forces far larger than any single neighborhood. As pressure intensified, Frank's restraint was tested repeatedly. Each test reinforced the same lesson: delay invited interpretation, and interpretation invited challenge. Frank did not seek conflict, but he no longer avoided it either. He allowed certain confrontations to occur under controlled circumstances, resolving them decisively and quietly. These moments did not make headlines, but they traveled through the city in the way that mattered most, through word of mouth among those who understood consequences. By the end of the first month, it was clear that the balance had shifted. The Italian Mafia recognized that Frank Lucas was not behaving like a temporary figure. Rival Harlem groups understood that probing had limits. Law enforcement sensed that something new was forming, though its shape remained indistinct. Frank had not declared war, but he had refused submission. That refusal, sustained under mounting pressure, was itself a form of escalation. Harlem now stood at the edge of a broader conflict. The vacuum left by Bumpy Johnson had not been filled quietly. It had been stabilized temporarily through discipline and calculation. Yet stability achieved through defiance is fragile. Frank Lucas had proven he could withstand pressure from every direction without collapsing. The next phase would test whether that resistance could be sustained when pressure turned into coordinated opposition, and whether the choices he made to secure independence would ultimately protect him or expose him to consequences far beyond Harlem streets. Silence, control, and the cost of power. By the second month after Bumpy Johnson's death, the strain on Harlem's fragile order had moved from visible tension to internal fracture. What Frank Lucas had achieved through restraint now demanded reinforcement through consistency. Silence alone could not govern indefinitely. It had to be paired with predictable outcomes. Frank understood that the real test of leadership was not how forcefully one reacted to pressure, but how reliably one responded to it. In Harlem crime history, leaders who survived longest were those who removed uncertainty from the daily calculations of everyone around them, not through spectacle, but through disciplined control. Frank's approach remained deliberate. He did not expand publicly or announce new boundaries. Instead, he focused on stabilizing relationships within Harlem that had once depended on Bumpy's authority. Disputes that lingered too long were resolved decisively, not to demonstrate dominance, but to restore routine. Routine, Frank believed, was the foundation of power. When people knew what to expect, they stopped testing limits. This mindset reflected a deeper understanding of New York organized crime, where volatility attracted attention and attention attracted consequences. The Italian Mafia continued to monitor Frank's behavior with growing unease. What unsettled them was not aggression, but independence. Frank did not seek meetings, nor did he openly reject them. He behaved as though their approval was irrelevant, a posture that challenged decades of hierarchy. In the context of Mafia versus Frank Lucas, this was an implicit provocation. Organized crime structures depended on acknowledgement as much as enforcement. By denying acknowledgement, Frank undermined the logic that sustained those structures, even without confronting them directly. Psychologically, the pressure intensified. Frank lived with the understanding that any misstep would be amplified. Loyalty was no longer abstract. It had to be enforced subtly and continuously. He watched for patterns rather than incidents, evaluating who adhered to expectations without supervision and who required reminders. Frank's leadership style did not rely on fear as a first resort, but he did not hesitate to allow consequences to speak when necessary. In the American Gangster real story, power maintained through selective consequence often appears invisible until it fails. Law enforcement scrutiny increased gradually. Federal investigators noticed that Harlem's internal conflicts were being resolved with unusual efficiency. This absence of chaos was itself suspicious. Historically, periods of transition in the Harlem drug empire produced violence, not order. Frank's ability to suppress volatility drew attention precisely because it contradicted expectation. Investigators began to reassess their assumptions, recognizing that stability could conceal consolidation rather than signify peace. Frank's internal calculus began to shift. He recognized that maintaining independence within Harlem was not enough. External leverage remained the greatest threat. Dependency on established systems created vulnerabilities that others could exploit. While he did not articulate these concerns publicly, they influenced his decisions. He reduced reliance on intermediaries and narrowed channels of communication, limiting exposure even at the cost of efficiency. This strategy slowed operations but increased resilience, a trade-off Frank accepted without hesitation. Emotionally, the cost was accumulating. Frank's world narrowed as trust became conditional and vigilance constant. Relationships that once felt familiar grew distant under the weight of responsibility. He understood that isolation was not a flaw of leadership but a consequence of it. Bumpy Johnson had carried the same burden, though he had managed it through negotiation rather than separation. Frank's path required a different endurance, one that relied on internal discipline rather than shared understanding. The community's perception evolved cautiously. Some viewed Frank as a stabilizing force, others as an unknown quantity whose restraint masked ambition. Frank did not attempt to shape these narratives. He believed that reputation followed behavior, not messaging. In true crime documentary perspective, leaders who survive prolonged scrutiny often do so by allowing others to define them slowly, rather than forcing an image prematurely. As weeks turned into months, the pressure reached a new phase. The Italian Mafia's patience was no longer indefinite. Federal investigations began aligning resources. Rival Harlem figures recognized that time was no longer on their side. Frank sensed that the environment was approaching a threshold, where silence would no longer suffice and decisions would carry consequences beyond Harlem's borders. He prepared not by escalating visibly, but by refining control internally, ensuring that when the moment arrived, his position would not collapse under stress. By the end of this period, Frank Lucas had achieved what few expected, sustained stability without submission. Yet that stability was precarious, maintained through constant vigilance and restraint. The cost of power was becoming clearer, not in material terms, but in isolation and exposure. Frank had proven he could hold the center, but holding it would soon require choices that tested not only his strategy, but his understanding of how far independence could be pushed before it provoked a response too large to contain. The silence that had protected him thus far was thinning. Forces beyond Harlem were aligning, and the next phase would no longer allow ambiguity. Frank's control had brought him to a point where survival depended not on restraint alone, but on confronting the consequences of the system he was building. The moment was approaching when history would no longer be shaped quietly, and the decisions ahead would determine whether Frank's rise would endure or unravel. Legacy, consequence, and the weight of history. By the time the final phase began to reveal itself, Frank Lucas no longer experienced pressure as an external force. It had become internalized, shaping every decision before it was made. Harlem was outwardly stable, but that stability carried a different texture than before. It was not the negotiated calm that had existed under Bumpy Johnson, but a controlled stillness maintained through vigilance. Frank understood that this distinction mattered. Stability achieved through restraint could last only as long as restraint was possible, and restraint, in turn, depended on forces beyond any single man's control. In Harlem crime history, this was the stage where outcomes became irreversible, even if they were not yet visible. Federal attention, once diffused, began to concentrate. Investigators did not move quickly or loudly. They did not need to. Frank's rise had altered patterns that had been static for years, and pattern disruption always attracted scrutiny. What made Frank's position uniquely vulnerable was not excess or chaos, but efficiency. The absence of disorder suggested coordination, and coordination suggested leadership. In the logic of a true crime documentary, this is often the point where the narrative shifts from ascent to consequence, not because ambition has peaked, but because visibility has quietly increased. The Italian Mafia, having reassessed its assumptions, adjusted its posture as well. Frank's refusal to seek accommodation had been interpreted correctly. He intended to operate without subordination. While open conflict remained undesirable, tolerance had limits. The Mafia's long memory did not frame the situation emotionally, but historically. Independent operators who disrupted established hierarchies rarely ended well, regardless of how disciplined they were. Frank understood this calculus, but he also understood that retreat would not restore the past. The path forward, however uncertain, was the only path left. Within Harlem, the effects of Frank's leadership became more complex. Stability had reduced open conflict, but it had also concentrated power. Some welcomed the predictability, others resented the narrowing of opportunity. Frank did not mistake acceptance for loyalty. He knew that power structures generate resistance simply by existing, and that resistance does not always announce itself openly. Ego, survival instinct, and fear continued to shape behavior in subtle ways, often invisible until they converged. Psychologically, the cost of command reached its peak. Frank lived with the awareness that every success increased expectation, and every expectation increased risk. Silence, once a shield, now functioned as isolation. He could no longer rely on the ambiguity that had protected him in earlier months. His reputation had solidified, and with it came assumptions that could not be easily corrected. In the American Gangster real story, this is where many figures misinterpret control as permanence. Frank did not make that mistake, but awareness alone could not eliminate consequence. Law enforcement pressure eventually transformed into action, not as a single decisive blow, but as cumulative weight. Investigations overlapped, information aligned, and alliances shifted. The system responded not to Frank's personality, but to the structural change his rise represented. His story was no longer just about Harlem. It had become part of a broader narrative about New York organized crime and the limits of independence within it. The very discipline that had enabled his ascent now ensured that his fall, when it came, would be comprehensive rather than chaotic. Looking back, historians would debate whether Frank Lucas's rise was inevitable or circumstantial. Some would frame it as ambition rewarded temporarily, others as a response to a vacuum that demanded resolution. What remains clear is that the night Bumpy Johnson died did not merely remove a man, it removed a system. Frank stepped into that absence not as a replica, but as a departure. His decisions reshaped Harlem's power structure, altered law enforcement priorities, and challenged assumptions that had governed organized crime for decades. The irony of Frank's legacy lies in its duality. His restraint prevented immediate bloodshed, yet his independence accelerated long-term consequences. He proved that power could be claimed quietly, but he also demonstrated that quiet power does not escape history's attention. Harlem changed because of him, not through spectacle, but through recalibration. The cost of that change was not confined to prison sentences or lost fortunes. It extended into the fabric of how authority would be perceived and pursued in the years that followed. In the end, Frank Lucas's story resists simple judgment. It is neither a celebration nor a cautionary tale in isolation. It is a study in transition, in what happens when loyalty outlives its context and ambition collides with structure. The last words spoken in a car on a quiet Harlem street did not crown a king in the traditional sense. They set in motion a sequence of choices whose consequences would echo long after the silence returned. Power was claimed, history was altered, and the cost, as always, was paid not in a single moment but over time.